The morning after the synchronization felt like waking up inside a tomb of frozen echoes. Kael stood in the center of the barn, his skin still prickling with the phantom heat of Seraphina's hand from the night before, but the studio had been transformed into a cold, clinical space of surveillance. Master Aris sat in his velvet-backed chair, like a king on a throne of rusted gears, playing back the recording of their shared breaths on a continuous, maddening loop. The sound filled the cavernous barn, amplified until it felt like the very walls were inhaling and exhaling with them. Every time Seraphina's recorded, desperate gasp filled the room, Aris would close his eyes, a look of twisted, artistic satisfaction crossing his gaunt face. He wasn't just listening to their love, he was dissecting it with a surgeon's precision, turning their most private, vulnerable moment into nothing more than a technical achievement, to be catalogued and sold. While Aris remained preoccupied with his obsessive frame-by-frame editing, he sent Cole to the deepest, most neglected part of the barn, a sub-basement known only as the Archive of Sorrows. It was a damp, lightless corridor lined with thousands of magnetic tapes that had never been touched by digital light. The smell was overwhelming, a pungent mixture of vinegar, decaying plastic, and the metallic tang of slow-moving water. Here lay the failures, the deleted scenes, and the sounds Aris had deemed too real or too terrifying for a public audience to hear. As Kael ran his fingers over the dusty, brittle labels, he realized he wasn't just organizing an archive. He was walking through a graveyard of human emotion, each reel containing a scream, a sob, or a confession that had been buried in the dark for decades, waiting for someone to listen. Hidden behind a stack of broken, rumbled boxes and shattered wood, Kael stumbled upon a single, pristine tape reel that looked out of place in the decay. It sat on a velvet cloth, labeled with a trembling hand, Clara, Winter 1998, the last session. Kael's blood turned to ice. Clara was Seraphina's mother, the woman whose presence was felt in every shadow of the barn, but whose name was never spoken. With a trembling hand, he placed the tape on an old, groaning playback machine and pressed play. He didn't hear a movie scene or a musical score. He heard a woman's genuine, crystalline laughter, followed abruptly by the sound of someone crying, with a raw, unedited agony. Then Aris's voice broke through, younger but just as cold, demanding she redo the sorrow, because the pitch of her grief wasn't perfect. Aris hadn't just recorded his wife, he had tried to master her soul, capturing her pain like a hunter pinning a butterfly to a board. Later that afternoon, Kael found Seraphina in the graveyard of objects, a section of the studio where thousands of broken porcelain dolls, shattered mirrors, and rusted clockworks were kept for creating unusual psychological sound effects. She was sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, surrounded by jagged shards of glass that caught the pale winter light like diamonds. Her face was a mask of quiet, terrifying defiance. She didn't need to ask if he had found the archive. She saw the ghost of her mother's voice reflected in the paleness of his face. "He thinks he can own a sound just because he caught it on tape," she said, her voice sounding like the first crack of ice on a frozen lake. She picked up a heavy porcelain doll's head and, with a slow and deliberate motion, crushed it under a rusted metal press. The sound was sharp, final, and hauntingly beautiful, a sound that could never be recreated, no matter how many times Aris pressed replay. As the winter sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the studio, Kael realized they possessed one biological advantage. Aris did not, the sensitivity of youth. Aris's ears were aging, losing their ability to perceive the highest, most delicate frequencies, the sounds that lived at the very edge of human hearing. Kael began to experiment in secret, using a high-pitched metal whistle and a specialized, ultra-sensitive microphone he had repaired in the dark. He realized he could leave messages for Seraphina, sonic ghosts that her father would never even notice. A series of high-frequency pulses hidden beneath the ambient hum of the studio's heaters. It was a secret telegraph, a way for them to speak in the bright light of the day while remaining completely hidden in the dark of the frequencies. The tension in the barn finally snapped when Aris entered Kael's small, cramped room without knocking. His eyes, sharp and predatory, immediately fell upon the glass marble resting on the bedside table, the one with the tiny frozen violet trapped inside. Aris picked it up with his skeletal fingers, holding it against the cold blue window light. A silent object, he mused, his voice dripping with a venomous disdain that made Kael's skin crawl. A memory that refuses to make a noise. It's useless to me, Kael. In this house, if it doesn't vibrate the air, if it doesn't leave a mark on the tape, it simply doesn't exist. To Kael's horror, Aris opened his hand and let the marble fall. It didn't shatter, it only made a dull, lonely thud against the hardwood. But the violet inside seemed to bruise and wither in the sudden impact of the fall. As a punishment for what Aris called distracting his most valuable asset, he forced Kael to spend the entire night alone in the Archive of Sorrows. His task was a cruel form of psychological torture. He was to erase thousands of feet of unusable tape. But there was a catch. Kael had to listen to at least 1 second of each reel before pressing the erase button to ensure nothing accidental was lost. Hour after hour, through heavy headphones, Kael heard disjointed snippets of human misery. Muffled screams, desperate sighs, the sound of a door slamming shut in 1974, a child's sob from 1982. Aris was making him the executioner of 1,000 memories. But in the middle of the coldest hour, a piercing high-frequency whistle cut through the static in his ears. Seraphina was using their secret telegraph from somewhere above. The high-pitched signal from Seraphina wasn't just a greeting, it was a sophisticated rhythmic code they had developed in the shadows. Stop listening to the past, the pulses seemed to scream into his brain. Listen to the bones of the house. Kael ripped off his headphones, the silence of the basement suddenly feeling heavier than the noise. He knelt down and pressed his ear firmly against the cold, damp stone of the floorboards. Through the rock and timber, he heard a series of rhythmic, heavy taps coming from the main studio directly above his head. Seraphina was using a heavy blacksmith's hammer on a lead pipe. To Aris it would sound like a heater malfunctioning or the barn settling in the cold, but to Kael it was a map. She was telling him that the sub-basement wasn't just a prison, it was a tunnel. Kael followed the vibrations of her taps, crawling through the dust and cobwebs until he reached the very end of the corridor, hidden behind a massive, rusted industrial ventilation fan. There, nestled in the grease and grime, he found a small modern microphone that had been active for years. It didn't belong to Aris. It was Seraphina's secret. Through this hidden ear, she had been recording her father's private mutterings, his late-night confessions to empty rooms, and his delusional plans to turn the studio into a museum of his own descent into madness. Kael realized that Seraphina wasn't just a bird in a cage. She was a predator in training, building a sonic weapon of her own to use against the man who had stolen her silence and her mother's life. Outside, the blizzard reached a terrifying peak, the wind screaming through the cracks in the barn like a wounded, dying animal. Inside, the atmosphere was even more volatile. Aris, driven by the storm's energy, had become obsessed with a new masterpiece he called The Final Breath. He demanded that Kael and Seraphina recreate the sound of two lovers saying goodbye forever at the edge of a crumbling cliff. "I want to hear the exact moment the hope dies in the throat," Aris screamed over the roar of the wind, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "I want to hear the sound of the absolute void." He was losing his grip on the boundary between art and reality, his pursuit of the perfect sound, pushing him into a dark, delirious state. In the recording booth, under the frantic, flickering red light, Kael and Seraphina stood closer than they ever had before, their bodies nearly merging in the shadows. They completely ignored the script Aris had written. Instead of a tragic goodbye, they leaned into the microphone and whispered their true names and their secret promises to each other. Sounds so soft and intimate they were buried under the intentional noise of the artificial storm Aris was mixing. Aris, with his failing, arrogant ears, only heard the loud, dramatic crashing of the waves and the howling wind he wanted to hear. But the high-fidelity tape captured everything. It captured their vow to escape whispering pines before the spring thaw, and it captured the sound of their hands joining in a pact of blood and shadow. The chapter ends with a sudden, deafening silence as the power in the barn flickers once and then dies completely, plunging the entire world into a thick, absolute darkness. In the pitch blackness, the only sound is the slow, deliberate creak of a heavy door downstairs, a door that was supposed to be double locked from the outside. Kael feels a sudden ice-cold hand clamp onto his arm, and a voice, not Seraphina's and certainly not Aris's, whispers a single urgent word directly into his ear. "Run!" The resonance of the secrets has finally shattered the studio's fragile walls, and the true long-buried ghost of Whispering Pines has finally decided to break its silence. Secrets never stay silent.